frame is both how you perceive a thing and how you react to them.
Ryan, you wrote a book called Praxeology Volume 1, Frame.
Notes. Jeez.
Page 1, you said frame is really difficult to explain. And your book reflects that because you have chapter after chapter about how to build frame, what to do with frame. And yet reading the book, you never really come out and say, this is frame.
Yeah.
Have you advanced your thinking since you published the book?
No, but there's a reason. It was actually, so these books, like, it's not me thinking this stuff up. It was generally me with like a group of about 10,000 guys, and everybody was kind of working on their marriages, that sort of thing. And frame was one of the overarching concepts that kind of came around from it. And there was one point where every now and then we get pretty critical of each other. It's like a little locker room of guys. And do you realize that, like, at no point in the last 5 years, anybody's even tried to describe what frame is or define it? But for some reason, the place kept kicking along, right? And so I wondered, like, how important is it to give it a solid definition? And then I was thinking back to, there's this blogger. I really loved him. He was The Last Psychiatrist. Have you heard of this guy?
I read about him in your book because you cited him, but I didn't know him otherwise.
Yeah, he was one of the bigger ones in the 2000s, like back in the Royce days and that. And he had talked about how in psychology, a lot of the times with how they would define disorders then became the mechanism to kind of drive people into them. So they kind of became their own worst enemy. And the reference he used was like, how do you define a person? And he was talking about how the DSM defines mental illness. Like, well, how do you define a person? Well, there's people have eyes, they have livers, and they have, femur bones. All right, well, dinosaurs have those too. All right, so they have eyes, livers, and femurs, and they're missing Dinosaurus. And then when you see here that as a definition for like what is a man, that makes no sense. But that's how we defined mental disorders. And the problem with that is, as we were going through and defining these mental disorders based on these surface characteristics, that we started treating the surface characteristics and not the underlying issue that the disorder actually came from. And so in a way, giving it a solid definition constricts your ability to move. And the whole point of all of this, all the praxeology, it's like a living document. Like, this could very well be out of date in a year. Somebody starts moving the work in some other direction and it ends up going there. And so it almost does it a disservice to give it a frame is X, Y, Z, and B, because then that's the only place it can go. And then people will start to fight over that definition of frame as opposed to the underlying concept it's trying to fix. And I think the easiest way to describe the underlying concept it's trying to fix is almost, it's stoicism, but it's not stoicism. Because stoics are, people tend to hear stoicism and then they think, who could be the better punching bag without complaining? And that's, I know that's not stoicism, but that's how the outcome of people who want to be stoic take it. So it's not very useful. It's sometimes it's selfishness, but it's not always selfishness, because you can be selfless as a choice. And sometimes it's just about doing enough work to have some dignity, some self-respect, some self-actualization, but it's neither of those things either. And so I don't have a good definition for it because I don't think it needs a definition, and it would not help it to have a definition.
Here's what I'm taking away. Frame is a metaphor. And when you pin down your metaphors to a definition, you lose the value of the metaphor.
It's like a good way of putting it. I'm going to steal that.
I hope you do. Because one of the things that I've learned from you is the importance of boundaries and how difficult my life was because I didn't know what they were and how to set them. And we're talking about frame as a metaphor, it calls up a picture frame. What's in, what's out. The way you perceive the painting changes because of the way that it's framed. A frame around a picture calls your attention to some things and it eliminates other things. It is the boundary of your perception. So when I think about frame, obviously I'm connecting it to this thing that I'm learning from you about boundaries. So I'm wondering,
not even just enforcing boundaries, but defining them. Yeah, because that's hard.
Yeah, I didn't know what they were. I didn't know I didn't have them. And then I had to figure out where I wanted them before I could figure out what enforcing them is.
Yeah. And why you want them there.
This is another beautiful thing about the metaphor. When you say frame, it doesn't say anything about what goes inside the frame. It could be the Mona Lisa. It could be some Jackson Pollock abstract thing. It could be impression. You get to decide what goes in the frame. The frame is how you're perceiving it.
Yeah.
There's another aspect of the frame as a metaphor. I'm an engineer. And we build
Ooh,
frames all the time, scaffolding, structural frames. And
house.
so, say what again?
Just like a plain house A-frame.
Yeah, exactly. You draw upon that metaphor too. You sometimes talk about frame as if it was a house frame. And
Yeah.
here it calls upon the concept of strength, but
Mhm.
also flexibility. You have a section about the oak. You say, it turns out, I think you're quoting someone who is referring to biosphere. It turns out that trees need wind to become resilient. And so this idea of frames has strength and flexibility. It is not just how our perception is shaped, but how we respond to the stressors and stimulus around us. This is a second metaphor with a different meaning. And I
Mhm.
want to ask you to respond.
Yeah. Well, it came out of University of Berkeley. They built a biodome, and they had found that the trees grew super tall, super big, but they were very fragile. They fell over, and it borrows a bit from Taleb's anti-fragility. But the idea was when the wind wasn't buffeting the trees, they spent all of their energy just growing bigger. When the wind is buffeting them and they're starting to fall over, they actually take a portion of that energy they would spend growing, and they use it to build. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's basically like structural strength. And so it's kind of similar thing for people. Yeah, a lot of these guys, and the reference was everybody wants to be an alpha male who earns a bunch of money. But yeah, maybe just like a single definition of what makes you who you are is not the best idea. If you want to be the guy that's just, I make all the money, and then you get in a marriage and you're working so much that, your wife doesn't ever see you, she divorces you, takes half your money. Well, why didn't you just work half that hard? You'd still have your half the money and you'd be with your family.
Yep.
And so, but then it's the idea. And then a lot of guys always talk about, oh, well, then women aren't even worth it. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. It's like, maybe, maybe not. But I'll tell you right now, you can't have frame single. I'm thoroughly convinced. I'm not saying you have to be married, but you can't be single because a girl's the only one that's going to test your frame. They have an innate skepticism bias. And Dr. David Buss talks about this, where from an evolutionary standpoint, they benefit more from false positives than false negatives. So what that means is, I think I got that right. I might have got it backwards, but if they always assume cheap investment signals are fake, they'll always come out ahead. So they will call a bluff as an instinct. Everything a guy does. So as a guy, your ego likes to tell you how great you are. Oh yeah, of course you're an alpha male. You're awesome. You're champion, scholar among men, patriarch. But then you got a girl behind you going, oh yeah, and then calls you to it. Now, guys who have frame, they're like that oak tree, right? They've spent some time actually backing up that talk. When you got the girl there that's always calling bluffs, always calling you out in your bullshit, are you that guy that just like crumbles down and starts getting mad and yelling at your wife or girlfriend or whatever? Or are you the guy that kind of laughs it off because, no, I've done the requisite work to be confident in what I'm asserting right now or what I'm claiming to be?
And so, in this part of the metaphor, a strong frame keeps its shape even when it's tested, whereas
Yeah.
a weak frame collapses under stress.
It's almost like it's not a frame because a lot of guys love those. They used to love talking about it like that. I had a strong frame and my wife whittled it down, or it's like it's a life bar in some video game. It's like, no, man, your frame is like it's your worldview. It's how you perceive things. It's how you react to things.
You use the word enforce boundaries, and
Right.
it's almost a violent word. It calls to mind law enforcement or other agencies that have power over subordinates. But that's
Hard
not how you're
power.
suggesting that boundaries are enforced, at least not in intersexual relationships. I don't know if there's another word, but before we get too caught up in force, will you explain, once you know what your boundaries are,
How
how
to enforce
you
them?
live them? Yeah.
Well, the boundaries is, I mean, that's easy. You can't use hard power anymore. The rule of thumb is not a thing. And thankfully so. I don't think it's a good idea to be able to just like beat somebody for not doing what you want. But so you don't have hard power anymore. So all you have is soft power. And I could define those. But we'll get into that later. The idea is you don't have the stick, so you can remove the carrot. So the only three things you have to enforce your boundaries are your attention, your affection, or yeah, your attention, your affection, and your commitment. And you just pull those commensurate with how bad the boundary was crossed. If a girl stayed out too late and you were supposed to be on a date at 10 and she showed up late, you probably pull your attention. You're like, all right, I'm just not going to go. We'll catch up later. If your wife cheats on you, obviously you're going to pull your commitment. Well, I mean, just for sake of argument here, so there's anyway. So yeah, you have all those things. But here's the thing: an ugly, unattractive man that nobody wants anything from, and is, a boss who has a useless employee, he's not going to care about those. So those boundary enforcement mechanisms only have any teeth to them if you have high, I think I use the words SMV, or sexual market value, essentially value. If nobody is worried about losing you, then your boundary enforcement has no teeth to it.
There's no
And so
carrot.
that's why, yeah, and that's why the dressing well, the fashion, the cologne, like looking well, being attractive, being charming, not being unattractive, being attractive, like all those things matter, because those are the tools that allow you to actually have boundaries and enforce them.
Frame takes work.
Yeah.
That structure doesn't build itself.
Work and self-reflection. That's the hardest. That's the harder part too. Like, when you were saying before about I didn't know what I wanted for boundaries, no guy does. And then my first question is always, well, what do you want? Like, wave a magic wand. If nobody can change, if you can't make anybody change their behavior, wave a magic wand, what changes? And nobody has an answer to that. So I'm like, well, first you got to think from there and then work backwards. And that's kind of where a lot of this stuff came from. So, yeah, guys just basically, please tell me what to do. And that's why Jordan Peterson's stuff was so popular. Clean your room, take on more responsibility. Guys like it because an authority figure is telling me how to live a good life. That's great. If it's not Jesus, it's Jordan Peterson, or heaven forbid, Andrew Tate. And I'm realizing most guys just want to be led. They're looking for a new dad online.
One of your insights about enforcement is you listed these three things. They're all things that you control inside you. A lot of people think of enforcement in the way that they experienced it in elementary school or something. Enforcing is about controlling other people's behavior. And what you're saying is enforcing boundaries is about disciplining your own behavior when your boundaries are transgressed.
Yeah.
It's a huge distinction.
Well, Dr. Thomas Barnett, I don't know if you know him. He's a geostrategic analyst or something like that. I can't remember what the title is of it, but he talks about this and the way he used it and got me thinking of this was the difference between empire, like the British Empire, and the American, whatever they call it, empire, was that those empires were things you must do. And the American one was just, if you want in part of the American global empire or whatever, then there's things that you like, as long as you don't cross these lines, global trade and that. And it kind of makes sense. And same thing with boundaries. Like, I cannot tell a woman what to do. That whole goof, like, I want to hold women accountable. It's like, no, you're not. You can't. Because what are you going to do? She's going to call your bluff. And then you're going to realize, short of like going to jail for DV, there's nothing you can do. So it's no longer about what you will do or else. It's about what I will put up with. And that's, again, a difference between hard power and soft power. You get a ticket, you talk to the cop. The cop has hard power. He can stop you if he wants. He can use deadly force if he wants to. So he has hard power. You don't have hard power, and you don't have a formal arrangement like a police officer or a judge would have with you. So all you have is soft power. It's always about coercion. And the only power men have right now is our ability to walk away. So if that's our tool, might as well use it and make it effective.